really important as part of this process. So I want to thank you again. I've gone way over my 2 to 3 minutes I was supposed to, but I'm really excited to see now 73 people have joined us for the call, and we are just going to have a really great session. So thank you. Ashley, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anika, for your inspiring words and for kind of setting the idea of where we're going today with this conversation. So in the emails you all got, we're calling this Let's Talk Data, because really the idea is we're going to talk about how we're approaching the indicators and how the indicators can be used to inform action. And now that we have this shared vision for an economically equitable Detroit, we're really in a good place to really start diving into what those indicators are and how we can use them to hold ourselves accountable for achieving this vision for an economically equitable Detroit. And so I know we have some new folks joining us today, and so we're going to start off our day with talking a little bit about what the center is and some of our goals and what this indicators project looks like. We're then going to talk more about developing economic equity indicators and what the process is and how they can be used to inform action. And then we'll finish off, with talking about our next steps for moving forward and how you can continue to engage with us in this process. Anika gave a shout out to the members of our team. You'll see them reflected on your screens. So Shari, who is our senior program manager and really leads up a lot of our community engagement work. Edward Lynch, he leads up all of our data work, our research work. So he's our indicators guy. Sema Abuhab, who is our research and engagement coordinator. Right now, she is the person behind the screen. So she is the magic worker who will be managing our Mentimeter, which will be a way that we can get input from all of you. And she's also somebody you can reach out to if you have questions. And then Drew, who is our intern with Wayne State University, who will be our fearless note taker this afternoon. So diving into kind of the project, as we've embarked on this work, Anika mentioned a couple of our wonderful thought partners in this work. In addition to all of you, we've pulled together a great group of folks who can inform our strategy, our approach, and also we're doing this work thanks to funding from the Kresge Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and Hudson Weber Foundation. So what is the Center for Equity Engagement and Research? So recognizing that there was an opportunity to grow DFC's really important role that it was playing around research and engagement in the region and in Detroit, we launched the Center for Equity Engagement and Research in January of 2020. And the center is continuing to build upon DFC's research portfolio of publications and special reports, which provide up-to-date information to residents and key stakeholders. And through this work, we hope that we can be a leader and a bridge builder between decision makers and community, and that we can empower residents and other community members with data and research to help drive change around economic equity, and also to be able to understand how decisions are being made and the information that's been used to inform those decisions. So for this first phase of our work, we've had 4 primary goals that we've been talking about at each of our stakeholder sessions. The first, which we just accomplished, was to establish a common vision for economic equity, which is what Anika just shared with all of you. And if you want to read more about it, it's included on our website. We have a whole document where we talk about the importance of having a vision. We talk about a call to action and why this work is so important and how we all have a role to play in it to make a more economically equitable Detroit. So the next phase of our work is to develop the Metro Detroit specific indicators and a dashboard to measure long-term impact. And so if you go to the next slide, that's where we are right now in this process. And that's why we are having this conversation with all of you today as we embark on this work. And surrounding all of this, we plan to continue to have high quality, accessible research on economic equity that can be used to advance the quality of life for all Detroiters, recognizing that when we have a more economically equitable Detroit, it benefits all of us. And as we go through this work, we're planning to continue to influence and engage corporations, investors, policymakers, and promote equity, because we recognize that this work cannot be done in a silo and we all have a role to play in advancing economic equity. So as a result of this first phase of our process, we will plan on producing an indicators report which will be a culmination and a synthesis of all of the indicators. And we'll talk a little bit more about some components of that a bit later in the presentation. And we plan to have a dashboard, which will be an online accessible format for the data, so we can make sure that the data can be in the hands of people who need to use it. So how do all these pieces fit together? So we're starting with this shared vision, right? So we have this shared vision for an economically equitable Detroit. Funding this vision, we will have our indicators. So the indicators are how we track our progress. It's how we hold ourselves accountable. It's how we measure where we're at. But surrounding these indicators, it's not just enough to have data, right? You need to understand the context. You need to understand the systems that are influencing this data. So we'll make sure that we surround the indicators with this context. Surrounding that will be the reports. The report's kind of the big structure that holds all of this information. Then there'll be the dashboard, which supplements the report and puts all the information on in the online. And the goal with all of this is that we're leading towards collective action, right? We want to galvanize action. It's not just enough to have data and numbers if you don't have action tied to it. We want to make sure that this information can be used to drive action forward. And the result of all of this is we want to make sure we have accountability. We want to make sure that we're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk, right? We want to make sure that we have numbers and information that can guide those actions to make sure that we are making that progress. So where are we in the project? Many of you started this journey with us back in early 2020, and some of you started this journey with DFC many, many years ago. But for the center was officially launched in January 2020. We started off with an equity forum, and that's really where people signed up for the first time to be stakeholders, and that group has only grown since then. In spring 2020, we worked on establishing just some baseline data to understand what's going on in Detroit. And we did some initial research. We looked at peer cities, we looked at other indicator projects, and we did a lot of framing and planning about how we approach the work of the Center for Equity Engagement and Research. Over the summer, some of you participated in our stakeholder sessions. We actually had over 300 people participate in those sessions and provide input. And we established this shared vision of economic equity. And from those conversations, we also asked folks about what matters to you? What do you think matters most in measuring related to economic equity? And we identified key categories, which Edward will talk a little bit more about in a minute, that would help guide where we focus our indicators. And then we started to identify just some baseline indicator data. And that's where we all sit in right now. So in fall of 2020, we're taking this moment because we think it's important, as Anika mentioned, to really look at the framing of the indicators and how we approach them. And so that's the conversation we're having today. And from there, we'll go on to refine the indicators, cultivate shared language, alignment. We'll have some more stakeholder engagement opportunities in December. And then moving into winter 2020 and early 2021, we'll develop the indicator report, which we hope will lead to galvanizing action and also convening and aligning. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Edward, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we develop the economic equity indicators and the categories. And Edward, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Yep. Awesome. Always forget to unmute myself. So here we go. Let's try that start again. And so thank you, Ashley, for that. And so we want to kind of, as we work through today, talk a little bit about the process, where we are, and a little later on, how we're going to get to where we're going. So this is kind of one in a series of stakeholder engagement events that we've been holding throughout the year. And so over the summer, we held a series of stakeholder events that led to the shared vision for economic equity that were released earlier this month, and that we've talked about earlier in the meeting today. But as part of those meetings, it was not necessarily just all about the vision and coming to that vision, but really defining a set of categories for our economic equity indicators. And so as we kind of move forward and kind of start to work towards identifying the specific indicators, these are kind of the broad broad categories that we're going to we think are important and as a group have identified and kind of take a deeper look at. The first is understanding the regional economy and what's going on in the region. And then we know that while we and kind of a lot of people on the call today care deeply about what happens within Detroit and to Detroiters and for Detroiters, we understand that we don't exist alone. And so what happens across kind of these broad regional systems is important. And to understand those and how those have an effect. We look at employment and Detroiters' access to jobs and where those could be and what they pay, what types of jobs, what qualifications they have, and some examples of things to look at. Businesses and self-employment and how entrepreneurship and how that fits in. There's a financial category, particularly around kind of household financial health and whether that lands as an income category and income or wealth. We're still kind of in the process of defining people's access to transportation, particularly as that relates to their ability to be economically self-sufficient and kind of have access to a lot of things both in the city and the region. Housing and people's access to safe, affordable, and quality housing is important to a lot of people, and that housing within desirable neighborhoods. Finally, kind of the last two pieces, people's access to education and quality education, both of the K-12, but also higher ed. And finally, important, while always important, especially important in kind of this time of kind of global pandemic, access to health and healthcare for residents. So those are the kind of the big picture points and the kind of the big categories that we've kind of identified as wanting to take a deeper look at as we kind of explore the economic equity indicators. And with that, I am going to turn over the mic to Thomas Goff, one of our friends and from Mass Economics, who's been working with us not only on this project, but they've been a longtime partner of DFC, going back a very, very long time. And so here's Tom, trying to bring us along.
All right. Hey everyone, can you hear me? First test. Okay, great. So hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about using indicator projects and sort of how to use them to inform action. Next slide. So every day you're going to see headlines about unemployment, poverty, income, inequality, COVID-19 more recently, and all of those are informed by economic data and indicators. Next. So through its past work, highlighting a few here, DFC has done a lot of work and has a ton of experience working with and analyzing economic data. And next slide. And use that data to really pull out important insights that are then used for agenda setting. So one example from the Growing the Detroit African American Middle Class. And in that work, DFC found that the city has a lower share of African American middle class households than the rest of the region. Also found that that number is declining in the city while growing in the rest of the region. So sort of based on this great foundation, next slide, and all of DFC's sort of strong data and research capacity, indicator projects are really a natural next step for the center to really compile data and then sort of implement change. So what is an indicator project, right? So at their core, they centralize, organize, and democratize data access, and this is related to equity and inclusive growth. They also have this important role of providing the shared, fact-based, defensible understanding of the disparities across both people and place. And then in recent years, we're also having this sort of increasing trend towards sort of an emphasis on collaboration and then educating leaders and policymakers to really help use the data to make change. So sort of taken together, really, indicator projects are this critical foundation for supporting equity-minded systems change. Yeah, so then here, so indicator projects, this is about this decades-long history. They go back quite a ways. I'm just going to start off with sort of these two sort of more traditional uses of indicator projects. And they really get at two key things. So first is really assessing the extent of inequities by place. That can be a state, a region, city, or even down to a neighborhood. And then also across subpopulations. To name a few, sex, race, ethnicity, foreign-born. And that's really that's usually in a snapshot, so at a given point of time. Who and where are the inequities now? Then it's related, but there's also this tracking component that basically looks at that assessment over time. And that really lets you understand if these indicators are improving, getting worse, staying the same, and sort of big picture, are things becoming more or less equitable? Then yeah, okay, next slide. So sort of how do you identify the inequities and the scale thereof? Indicator projects sort of most usually you're comparing data across geographies, Detroit versus the rest of the region, or Detroit to the US. You're also comparing maybe within neighborhoods, east side, west side, whatnot. There's also sort of at the core, is comparing across demographic groups. So some of the race, ethnicity, sex, foreign-born we talked about. And on the right, you're just seeing some examples of that from other indicator projects. The next slide, we're also sort of seeing a little bit more recent development. Are indicator projects that are tracking against sort of an ideal. Hey, maybe that's perfectly equitable income. It can also be around sort of a defined target or goal. Indicator projects are increasingly moving towards setting some, hey, in 10 years, you want to bring the poverty rate down to X. But in this next slide, there's just this important point here I'm going to walk through. That indicator frameworks can evaluate the outcome, sort of the end results, income, unemployment. They can measure those using different criteria. So sort of sadly, we usually start in the US, we usually start from a baseline of inequity. So in this example here, we're looking at median household income by race and ethnicity. So the baseline here is African-American Detroiters only have about 75% of the household income of white Detroiters. That's 30,000 versus 41,000. But in this first scenario, you can ask, is income growth equal? And you can see that the lines sort of have the same slope, right? They're both parallel going. And the issue there is that doesn't address the initial conditions. At the end of the day, 10 years later, there's still a gap of 75%, and also in absolute terms, that gap got bigger, actual dollars, that's a bigger amount. Next slide, you can then ask, hey, is income growth equitable and just? So in this scenario, it really closes the gap across those groups, and you can see those two lines match and hit the same value in 10 years out. And that's wonderful, but that still doesn't address the huge historic inequities that have caused this massive wealth gap. I think in the US, nationwide, the gap is about 10x for white household wealth versus African-American wealth. So you can see on this last sort of scenario, we're asking, is income growth reparative? And then, hey, that African-American household income even goes above, higher than the white Detroiter income to sort of try to attempt to close some of that wealth gap. All right, so all right, next slide. So yeah, so we sort of, with that, we've covered some of sort of the core considerations for indicator projects, but also just want to call out, where are indicator projects today? And how do you really use all that cool data? And how do you use indicator projects to actually impact systems change? So over the past decade or so, indicator projects have really evolved and also broadened their functions from just tracking and updating the data every year. They're sort of going beyond into these expanded set of functions. So you can see it, first one, agenda setting, advocacy, and policy. So the data behind indicator projects can be used to help inform advocacy, to help inform, test the equitableness of different policies. And generally you'll see indicator projects, sometimes they'll be running these efforts on their own, but more often you're seeing them sort of partnering with advocacy groups and policymakers on the ground to implement more equitable policies. The mid and long-term goals, just mentioned a little bit earlier, but right, we're seeing increasingly that indicator projects are starting to set sort of mid and long-term goals for their indicators, and they can track how they're doing compared to those goals over time. Are we on track to hit that poverty reduction in 10 years or not? Subject area research, I'd say this one, some indicator projects have been doing for prior to 10 years ago, but really it's sort of using the indicator data to help support specific research, both by others, and partners and academics and city governments, but also the organizations themselves. So it's often digging really deep into the data on some particular subject, and more, most recently, there's a lot of work digging into the impacts and drivers of COVID-19. And then lastly, indicator projects and their data are used to support funding and grant writing. And again, both directly and then also partners, whether that's nonprofits, government, foundations, sort of grassroots community groups, but all of them can make use of indicator project data to really help apply for grants. All right, so yeah, just wanted to give a couple of examples, sort of building from that last slide, to sort of highlight how indicator projects are sort of evolving to better implement systems change. So the top, just going to start with some sort of cross-cutting trends we're seeing, and then get down into a handful of examples there. So generally speaking, we're seeing this increasing trend towards making data more interactive with maps and custom geographies and custom reports, and also just more accessible, which is sometimes, hey, I can do this on my phone and know what's happening in my neighborhood, but variety of means there. Really interesting is they're really sort of going beyond just one data platform or one dashboard, one way to get the data across. So they're really developing tailored content for different audiences to support sort of the wide range of change agents, right? So it's a little bit of a stereotype, but hey, the CEO, they want a PowerPoint. They're not going to read it unless it's in a PowerPoint. Maybe, for legislators and representatives, they want, a policy brief. For the policy wonks, they're maybe going to read the entire 100-page report on the nitty-gritty. But yeah, it's really, the goal there is just creating content that targets different audiences so they can better absorb and sort of best use the data to create systems change sort of in their lane and in their sort of local ecosystem. You're also seeing this sort of more recent trend around developing indicators in response to some immediate crisis with really current timely data. So the earliest version of this that we found was really the Katrina index. That was sort of in response to this total void of data after the hurricane. Then more recently, and I'm sure if you're Googling around on the web, you'll come across some of these. There's a lot of indicator projects that are focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. To name a few, the Century Foundation's unemployment insurance dashboard has weekly updated data. The Boston Indicators Project has a dashboard that's also updated weekly, tracking COVID cases and deaths, and so sort of a little bit of a new thing. But then yeah, sort of getting to some of the specific examples of those 4 categories we talked about on the previous slide. I'm going to call out, the National Equity Atlas by PolicyLink. Some of their data was used sort of in the fight to get a 15 per hour minimum wage in California. The mid and long-term goals, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, their onto 2050 indicators project. They have definitive goals for every indicator in there, and they're tracking their progress towards those goals. Down in some subject area research, can just there's lots of examples here, but we'll call out UNC and UNC Charlotte specifically, using Charlotte Mecklenburg County's Quality of Life Explorer for some of its research on the racial wealth gap. And then lastly, just call out, yeah, in New Orleans, really one of the founding sort of raison d'etre was trying to support nonprofits with grant writing and trying to make the case using data to get that financial support. All right, so that was a lot, but gonna stop for a nice little question break. So after that big review, so how do you see your organization using the economic equity indicators to make change? And yep, Sema just popped up the link in the chat. You can also type it in there. And then yeah, use that code, and looking forward to hearing your responses, and then we'll keep going with the rest of the presentation in a little bit.
It's like a race to the finish. Which one's gonna come ahead? Keeps changing. Everyone, please definitely, we'll take one more minute for everyone to get their votes in on how you see your organization using economic equity indicators to make change. So far, it looks like mid and long-term goals is one of the biggest uses that people are highlighting, but it looks like, you know, across the board, interest in funding and grant writing, agenda setting, tracking, subject area research are all really important uses that you're all identifying as ways that you can use this information.
We'll call it on the Mentimeter for now. All right, so this so just only a couple of slides here, but they're pretty meaty. And really, it's just first off, just want to ask, where does this project fit into broader efforts to advance equity in Detroit? So as Anika mentioned, indicators really are the first step in this process. There's a lot that comes after, but sort of going to sketch out a little bit of this sort of framework here. And as we're sketching this out, the process of making a pie was sort of a nice metaphor. So first off, just walk through here, what are economic outcomes in this first column? That's really sort of the size of the pie, and that's what the regional economy category that Edward mentioned earlier when sort of going through the 9 categories that we have. But for example, the economic outcomes would be, hey, total number of middle wage jobs in the Detroit region. And really sort of the point there is as a necessary condition for Detroiters to have access to middle wage jobs, there actually need to be enough. There need to be some middle wage jobs in the city and region, right? But then this other piece, the distribution of outcomes, and think of that as really how is the pie divided across different populations and places, really who holds those middle wage jobs. And say most indicator projects that we see sort of stop at those first two boxes on the far left, and some really only focus on the distribution of outcomes, period. They don't even think about or take into account some of the sort of regional context. Then the DFC's indicator project, it's gonna go a little bit over here to the outcome drivers. And these are the things that influence the outcome measures on the left-hand side, the unemployment, the poverty, all of that. And you can think of them maybe sort of as the ingredients in the pie. And another example would be asthma rates, maybe by race, are driven by the location of air polluters. So an outcome driver would be, where are those air polluters located? Another one would be home ownership is driven in part by the capacity of mortgage lenders and banks, right? So, hey, if you have moldy, rotten apples going into your pie, then the end result is your apple pie is not going to taste so great, and the outcome is, yeah, not a good pie. So basically, these first two columns reflect sort of the indicator, DFC's indicator project, but right, they're only the first step in the process. Then next slide. They are, however, they're an extremely important first step because they're really the foundation for getting to the Detroit that we want to see, which is some of the sort of how do you change systems is on the right-hand side there. So upstream of outcome drivers and the outcomes are really policy and programs. And that can be local, state, federal governments. That can also be foundations, nonprofits, business policies and programs, all of it, sort of the full spectrum there. Maybe those could be the recipe in the cookbook that really tell you how do you make the pie. But sort of as an organization, you can, and DFC's indicator project can or these efforts, you can evaluate policies. You can also sort of directly use data to help shape those policies, and working with advocacy and policy groups sort of on the ground to help sort of direct some of those policy and programs and looking for gaps and where to improve. And then on the far right, you really have sort of the team of people who really make the cookbook, the chefs, the authors, the publishers, the distributors of the book. And it's really about sort of decision-making, the local power structures. And that's local government, that's the foundations, it's nonprofits, sort of everybody on the ground who's helping inform the policies and programs that get made. But it's also about sort of representation, it's your voices, and it was related earlier to sort of that accountability piece of who's making these policy and programs that downstream affect all these other key important points. So basically, in summary here, these indicator projects are the foundation, but recognizing that, other components are really needed to move systems change forward. Some of those some of those boxes on the right-hand side. And so DFC in the center knows we're going to be doing these first two columns, but we're really still working through what our role is going to be for the changing system size and what pieces of that and how far to the right we're going to go. So all of you guys on this call are going to have a role in making systems change, but we want to hear from you sort of where do you think DFC should play? What role should they have, and how far up or down this sort of continuum they should go? Yeah, one more Mentimeter poll, and yep, code's 5834998. We'll continue the last section of the presentation after we get your responses.
Great, so we're saying drive policy changes that benefit Detroit and the region, create consensus on top priorities, mobilize a unified coalition to advocate, use indicators to influence city decisions, to be a collaborator, trumpeter for change, working with others, influencing key leaders and stakeholders, setting goalposts, using it to identify efforts that actually lead to greater equity, recommending specific policy changes at the city, county, and state levels, coalition building. I'm seeing a lot around coalition building and convening, a lot around like the common language and metrics, agenda setting, really working in partnership with the city on some of their policies. Needs to be a campaign with policymakers, be a cross-sector convener, reviewing and assessing policies, ecosystem mapping of systems being measured. That's a great recommendation, something we've been thinking about too. Let's see, a data warehouse linked to resources. Holding policymakers accountable to taking action based on the data, working with existing programming to implement change, recognizing there's so many folks who've been doing this work and continue to do this work. This is great, everyone. We'll give you 1 more minute to add your thoughts, and please note you can add multiple submissions. So if you have multiple ideas, feel free to add them. And really thinking through, you know, Tom's previous slide around different ways we can influence the system. Great. Wonderful. We'll keep going.
All right. So we're now going to take a look into the sort of approaches to indicator projects, and with that, a little bit of some set of examples, and give you a sense, get a little bit closer to the nuts and bolts of things. So first, just starting off, sort of giving you this overview of some national indicator models, and you can see that they'll vary on sort of different scales or foci. Some of them are really just looking at one city and maybe the neighborhoods within it. Others are looking at the full region, and then others are sort of looking across multiple cities and regions, you know, hundreds of geographies, and doing comparisons across those. You'll also see there's a bit of a range in terms of the number of categories, from a low down to about 4, and then you have going up to 9. And And then maybe the most important point here is just the wide range in the number of indicators. And it's maybe overall, you see some are down at 14, and on the really high end, which is probably too much for us, and sort of challenging to really be easily used, above 200. But so most of these are, order of magnitude. We're talking 20 to 40-ish is somewhere in there. We're obviously still working through that, but yeah, 100 indicators gets painful for usability. And so yeah, just sort of wanted to just give you a sense of sort of the spread across some of these national indicator models. So the next slide then, calling out that, right, the data needs vary by approach. And most indicator projects rely pretty heavily on federal data. So that's things like the US Census Bureau, where it's standard data, it's available across the entire US. And just calling out that, right, sort of on the left-hand side there, you have the National Equity Indicators Project, which is 100% federal. And that's because, hey, they need to have apples to apples data across, what is it, the 100 largest US cities, all of the MSAs across the US. So they really need to rely on federal data sources so that they can actually compare across these geographies. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Quality of Life Explorer, which is really focused just on one county, and that can rely on more local data sources. So that's in red, it's over 75%. Over 3/4 of the data are really local. So you just get a sense of sort of the range here. But the next slide we're going to talk about, next two slides, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these trade-offs between the more federal data and more local data. So on the left, we're calling it existing and new, but really the existing is mostly this federal data and state data. And then on the right-hand side, you have this new data, which is often local. So both of those data sources can be helpful and pretty robust when it comes to measuring outcomes, like the unemployment, the poverty rate. They both can be helpful for getting at some of the outcome drivers as well, EPA, air polluter locations, right? But where the federal data and the state data get weaker is really on, if you're trying to evaluate sort of the equity around processes, which really you can think of that as sort of the right-hand side of that chart you were looking at earlier, where it's really the how are decisions made, who gets a voice, who decides what policies and programs get implemented and which don't, which never see the light of day, right? Then there are some important considerations as well around sort of the level of effort and costs and the comparability of data across place. So a real strength of that federal and state data is it's free, it's readily available, and you can compare it to, you can compare Detroit to the rest of the region, or to a different city in the region easily, no problem, right? Whereas with local data, it's a huge time and cost investment to dig up and sometimes create new data, and then how do you get it standardized so it's comparable and apples to apples, Detroit versus Chicago or whatever, right? That's a huge undertaking, and is sometimes close to impossible. It can really hurt. Then on the other side, on the flip side, the local data can sort of help build local data capacity, amongst both the organization, but also, right, city government, other foundations, nonprofits, even businesses sort of tracking and monitoring this data and helping to create this new data. It can also be sort of more flexible and can help you get at sort of more, innovative or new metrics where we were never tracking this before. It was, it was not on the Census Bureau's radar, and all of a sudden, great, now we can measure this with a lot of effort, but you could maybe measure it. So yeah, so just on the right-hand side, I think covered most of these, but just sort of giving you a little bit of a sense of some of these pro-cons, where the federal data is high quality, it's available, you can compare sub-geographies, So I'll say sort of right now, I think the DFC Sierra Indicator project is probably going to start with some of the existing data sources. But with time, we do want to work with you guys and, and partners on the ground in the city to sort of explore how we can maybe develop new data sources and new data capacity. But for starters, really probably relying mostly on some of the existing data. So then just next slide, last slide here is just sort of give you some examples of sort of these trade-offs in practice. So on the left, you have this, again, seen policy link where it's, 100% federal data. And right, it's high quality. Hey, you can compare neighborhoods and regions and cities across the US. That's great. But the drawbacks to that are also you don't get to decide what you're comparing. You are limited by what does the Census Bureau, what do the federal government and federal agencies produce. You also do have some limited information on the drivers, and again, you miss out on any sort of process measures. On the right-hand side, there's this quality of life explorer, and right, you can create new data capacity. You can get a little bit more information on some of the drivers of outcomes, like the age of the commercial building stock, for example. The data can be hyper local, but then right, the drawbacks are this intense, massive sort of effort around collecting and standardizing that data. There's also issues that since this is so much of a big effort, you often only have snapshots of the data. So you only have one point in time, and then, oh no, it's 2 years later, you're trying to recreate and get sort of apples to apples data, and oh no, something has changed, or you can't, or there's suppression, you have to do suppressions and exclusions of some neighborhoods or geographies because the data aren't there. So it can hurt and get painful and really limit you if you're trying to track change over time and the impact of your policies and the various changes going on. You could be sort of flying blind for years, or if it's not possible, just that's it. The indicator's gone. So this is sort of just, in summary, this is sort of a nice example sort of showing some of the extremes here. But yeah, I think with that, actually going to sort of turn it open to just general Q&A, I think.
Yes, and it looks like we have a question in the chat already. But if everyone could, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll field them across Tom, myself, Anika, Edward, our whole team will kind of attack the questions. Also, I know some of this information takes time to marinate and think about. And so again, I'd encourage if after the presentation, you have a question, don't hesitate. You're happy to have conversations and kind of dive into it deeper with you. But I see we have,
Ashley, yeah. Are we going to email out the presentation or put it up on our website?
We will definitely email out the presentation.
Okay, great.
Yep, and we're recording this as well. So I see a question from Don Jones about addressing the challenges of the Detroit MSA data versus the need of Detroit-focused data. Tom, perhaps that's something you could talk a bit about?
Yeah, so I think even under that a couple slides back, there's sort of existing data with the state and federal data sets. I mean, you can still get a lot of that. You can get into the city of Detroit versus the rest of the region. And you can also get, familiar with census tracts, right? Those little sort of geographies, a couple of them might represent a neighborhood. So yeah, I mean, you can still get into a lot of that type of data, but I guess an example might be where it would be a lot more challenging, might be something like if you wanted land use changes over time, across the entire region and having standardized land use codes and standardized snapshots, right? You can definitely pick out some examples where it would really be painful. So yeah, there'll be some of these aspects would be, more difficult at an MSA level, but really, we can still do a lot at a city versus region scale.
Any other questions? Please feel free to use the chat function and add your question directly there.
Hey, Ashley, this is Don. I'm just going to follow up
Okay.
if I can. So I understand Tom's exactly what you're saying that, but, and again, this is coming from a great wealth of ignorance. The economic data, in terms of household income and such like that, how often that's collected at that census tract level versus, what's done through that's I think some of the challenge when we're trying to figure out the change over time. I think that's I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah. So right. I'll try not to go too into the weeds, but right. Like, let's say with American Community Survey data, right? You can get data down to the census tract level, and it reflects data from 5 years. They sort of package that together into a 5-year sort of blob average to let you look at census tract level data. But yeah, to your point, sort of proper data methods, you don't really want to look at, 2014, 2018, a 5-year release, and then look 1 year later and say, oh, what's the change, right? Because there's 4 years of overlap of the same data. So right, there is this aspect, sort of your time frames of when are you tracking these indicators? Is every indicator annual? Is some maybe you actually look at a 5-year blob of this time versus that time, and then maybe as each year, hey, you could update so that that 5-year chunk moves with you under that time frame. But yeah, so you can address that. Yeah, to your point, yes, it is a little bit difficult if you're trying to get sort of individual year by year change at a census tract level. I mean, some real fancy people try to do it, but at the end of the day, it's kind of just you're still dealing with 4 years of overlap, so it's not great. So yeah, I think we would go with that sort of block approach of 5-year to 5-year, and then moving along. So if that was too in the weeds, happy to follow up with more nitty gritty.
Thank you.
It looks like Eric put a comment just about how web and cell phone based apps make it easier now for residents to collect micro level data. For example, with property info, we have LandGrid as a proven model here in Detroit. And yes, that is digging down to kind of the more micro level data. And for us, we're going to be really looking at more at like kind of systems level data. Not to say there aren't opportunities for us to later on dig down deeper, but really looking at the higher level. Great. Well, if you have additional questions, put them in the chat along with your email address, and we can respond back to you later. But we'll now talk a little bit about how we move from the indicators into the products. Because we want to make sure as we do this work that we're creating products that are useful for your work. Tom talked a little bit about this earlier and how different people digest information in different ways. And so when you look at other indicator projects, you might see someone's put out a 200-page report. Not everyone's going to read a 200-page report. And in order for us to be effective, we need to make sure that we're creating tools that can actually be used to inform all of those goals that you all identified that were important to you in your work. So the setting short-term and mid-term goals, the fundraising, setting agendas. We need to make sure we're creating something that enables you in order to do that. So there's something that we talk about that's called, and some people hate the term, but it's referred to as a pyramid of products. At the biggest base level at the bottom, you have the full report. That's something we know we're going to develop. You can also have then an executive summary within the report that breaks down the information in a digestible format. We're going to do that. Where we want to get your input on is there are other ways that we can break down the information, and we want to find out what will be most useful and helpful to you so that you can use this information to inform your actions. So some other ways the information can be broken down. Toolkits. So the information from the indicators reports can be put into a shorter document, 5 pages or so. It can include summary of findings. It might include the so what. It might include recommendations around action steps or resources. There's also the opportunity to do one-page fact sheets. These are things you can hand out in meetings. High-level findings, puts it down, one sheet of paper. Here's what the challenge is. Here's what the data says. Here's what to do or how to engage. We can also break it down into slide decks. We've heard that for some folks, they like having a slide deck or a set of slides that they can plop into their own presentation as they're talking around economic equity, or as you're talking to a board, or as you're talking at a committee meeting. Having easy plug and play slides with the data, the findings that you can use as you talk about this. Talking points. You know, as an organization internally, we always have our own talking points that we develop to make sure that we're communicating clearly and effectively about the results of a project. But there's also the opportunity to pull kind of those high-level talking points for you as well that you can use, again, in your presentations or as you're talking to the folks in your spheres. And lastly, social media. You know, we all leverage social media platforms for the work that we do to communicate messages. It's that tiny little tweet or it's that graphic for Instagram, but there's the opportunity to create social media content that you can then repost or that you can use as part of the content that you create on your own sites. So again, this is taking the content from that big full report and drilling it down into ways that are usable. And so we wanted to pose the question to you about what products would you find the most useful for us to create as part of this process, in addition to the full report. And if you have additional ideas that aren't part of what we've put on here, we'd love to hear them. So you can vote for the ones that we've identified through the Mentimeter link that Summa just put in the chat, and that's on the slide here. And if you have additional ideas, put them in the chat. It looks like Gary already created. He talked about using e-newsletters as a great way and breaking down information and presentations that can present circumstances and solutions. So please, you know, go to the Mentimeter, take a vote. It's a sliding scale, so you can kind of rank from, you know, least useful to most useful. But if you have new ideas, put them in the chat as well. I see notes too about using e-newsletters as a helpful way. Being able to download data, yes. Shape files and maps to use as well. Yep. Let's see in the chat, a way to manipulate parts of the data specific to the sector specific work. So you can drill down, I guess, by housing, you could drill down by workforce development or whatnot. All right. So it looks like we have toolkits are useful, one-page fact sheets, talking points are helpful, social media a little bit less so, but still helpful. Slide decks. All right, we'll give everyone maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to get your vote in. So again, the Mentimeter link is in the chat. You can click on it and it'll take you directly to the voting. This will be really helpful, as I said, to help us understand the types of tools to create to make sure that you can use the information and it can help you. All right, so it looks like toolkits and fact sheets have emerged as kind of the most useful resources, but that slide decks, talking points, and social media can be helpful as well. Great. Wonderful. All right. So next we're going to talk about moving forward, which is something that Edward will talk about with you briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk quickly about the next steps in the project and where we're going from here and how we get to the final indicator dashboard. So here we are today. So over the next month or so, we're going to kind of take a look and deep dive into the indicators and kind of identify a set of draft indicators, and then come back for during the first part of December for some deep dives into those indicators, where we would kind of look at kind of what those are and how people see those manifesting themselves on the ground here in Detroit and also the region. From out of that, we'll kind of refine a final set of indicators and move forward into the beginning part of next year, creating the draft version of the report prior to that, and then hopefully towards the end of winter in March of 2021, having a final draft of the report released. And so that's the process we're kind of working towards, and what we're working towards. Again, looking at this kind of set of categories and indicators here, and these kind of 9 categories here will lead us into the final question we have for today, which is based on your expertise or interest. Take 2 or 3 categories and tell us what you think kind of one of the best indicators to measure economic equity for that would be. And so we have the back on Mentimeter with the code 7052306.
So again, everyone, this is as we look at these categories for the indicators, thinking through where your area of expertise is, your area of interest, what do you think would be important things to measure towards economic equity? And it's okay if you don't have that answer or that idea right now. Again, you can email us or follow up with us afterwards. There's the household income. Some, if it's possible, to scroll through the others. We've gotten them. Education, home ownership gaps, education adjusted income gap. For housing, looking at shelter overburden for people experiencing homelessness, home ownership rates by race and ethnicity. Family wealth, health, and longevity. For education, looking at college persistence and degrees, access to high quality pre-K and early childhood, measures of socioeconomic integration in K-12, right? Housing, employment, transportation, the 3 main drivers. Access to capital, that's one we've been talking about a lot. Percentage of Detroiters with job paying whatever Detroit's unique formula considers a living wage, and an average distance from that job, less than 10 miles. For employment and small businesses, entrepreneurship, neighborhoods, local property ownership. Neighborhood polling of specific needs. Entrepreneurship and self-employment. Workforce training and employment. Household assets. Travel outside of city for jobs. So who's traveling where, how far are they having to travel, and how much are they earning? I know some of our recent reports have looked at disparities in, if you're a teacher with a bachelor's degree, the difference between what you get paid working in Detroit versus in the region. Housing stability, housing rent burden is a key indicator. See community safety in the chat. Housing cost burden at regional and city scale housing, healthy home indicators, lead and asthma. levels, income levels, high school graduation rates. Great. Decrease of the wealth gap in income. Homeownership gap in here, lots of homeownership, jobs, education. All right. Environmental equity issues. Health, extensive business ownership between groups, wage disparities and disparities in education and job skills training. Great. Job growth in businesses with less than 10 employees. Community amenities and safety. Great, we'll give this one more minute. So if you haven't gotten all your ideas in yet, make sure to add them into Mentimeter now. Kids living in households with the income to meet basic needs above the ALICE threshold. Generation and the elevation of family wealth is not just about income, it's about increasing wealth and intergenerational wealth. Education completion. Finding ways to get Black power and decision-making over money. Maybe something like Black decision-making suites and philanthropy in corporations. All right, so that will close the Mentimeter, but please make sure if you have other ideas that weren't captured, shoot us an email. So with that, we're going to close our conversation. As we talked about, the idea was to kind of set the framework for how we're approaching indicators, the role that indicators can play and the importance of them, and how they can help drive forward systems change. We got great input from you all on how you see yourselves being able to use the indicators towards change, and input from you on how you would like to see us at DFC use these indicators around economic equity to drive forward change, and how we can make sure that what we are creating is in a format that empowers you to use this data and the research in your work. So as far as next steps, there's continued opportunities to engage. One of the ways is we just released this shared vision for economic equity, which was informed by all of you, and we got wonderful feedback on that. We would love for you to make sure that you are sharing it with your organization, using the call to action in there to talk about what role your organization plays in moving forward economic equity and in systems change, and really encouraging those discussions. You can also join us in December. So between now and December, we're going to be working on pulling those indicators. We're going to take in information from all of our previous stakeholder sessions. We're going to look at those categories. We're going to take into consideration some of the things that you lifted up today. And we're going to really narrow in on what those indicators are, and then have an opportunity in December to do a deep dive by subject matter area. We're still refining what the structure of those meetings will be. So make sure you're signed up for our stakeholder email list at the link below, and you'll be in the loop for when we announce those sessions and the dates for that. That's really going to be the opportunity to go deeper into what the actual indicators are, understanding the context and the history around it. And we're really going to be looking at leveraging your expertise as either people who are working in this space or people with lived experience who are experiencing and living this every day. So definitely keep an eye out for those emails. And then also continue to share your thoughts around economic equity on our website and through our emails. We've looked at that there's opportunities to submit videos and audio with your thoughts on economic equity, but also to share them with us. And so at the end of this presentation, Sema's email address is up there. Feel free to email her to share your thoughts, your ideas, your feedback, and she'll make sure it gets to us within the Center for Equity Engagement and Research team or with DFC, and we'll make sure to get back with you or connect with you as well. So thank you all so much for participating with us this afternoon. We hope you found it informative, and we are so excited and grateful for you for being a partner in this work with us. So we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as we say in the shared vision document, let's get to work. For our DFC team, perhaps, why don't we end the meeting so it helps everyone get out and then we can join back in to do a debrief.